Welcome to Rewired for Love. I am your host, JaCarie Owens, licensed mental health counselor, EMDR basic training coach and consultant, group practice owner and supervisor at Courageous Minds Counseling, relational trauma expert, and the most important one, your honest but loving homegirl therapist who's not afraid to talk about the messy parts of healing. Around here, we talk about all things nobody taught us growing up, how our attachment styles show up in love, why our nervous system acts like a fool sometimes, and what it really takes to feel safe in our bodies. So this is not about perfection. It's about learning to love yourself in real time with grace, boundaries, and a little bit of humor. So take a deep breath. Get comfy, because we don't chase chaos, we choose calm. And this is Rewired for Love. Hey y'all, welcome back to Rewired for Love. So last week, we dived into Princess and the Frog from an attachment lens and helping you to look at it from a different perspective. And I truly hope that that is starting to really help you to understand attachment and how it affects how people show up in the world. This week, we're going to go to another show. And I love this because it makes it fun to really talk about attachment. So this week, we're talking about people with main character syndrome or attachment trauma. And we're talking about what Euphoria gets right about relational trauma. That's right. Today, we're talking about a show that had everyone stressed out, confused, yelling at the TV, and me personally had me texting my friend saying, girl, what is wrong with these people? And if you have ever watched Euphoria, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, before we get started, let me say this. This is not me diagnosing fictional characters. This is not me making excuses for harmful behavior. This is simply me doing what therapists do. Looking, being curious, and exploring what happened to these people. Because one thing I've learned after years of working with people is this. Most behavior makes sense when you understand the wound underneath it. And Euphoria is basically one big, gigantic attachment wound with some good music, but an attachment wound nonetheless. So as we jump in, I want to start with the main character, and I may be a little bit biased, so I want to make sure that I'm looking at Rue from this very unique lens. So let's start there, because I feel like everyone looks at only the addiction when they're thinking of Rue, but I think that they're missing the deeper story. Because remember the scene after Rue comes home from rehab. Her family is hopeful, her mother is hopeful, and everybody wants things to be different. And then Rue meets Jules. When Rue meets Jules, she immediately becomes emotionally attached. And it's not because she's weak. It's not because she's desperate. But it's because for the first time in a long time, somebody makes her feel alive. Somebody makes her feel connected. Somebody helps her to escape the overwhelming loneliness that she is carrying. And here's what I want y'all to notice. People often think attachment wounds are about being too needy. And that's not always true. Sometimes attachment wounds look like trying to find relief from emotional pain. Because underneath the addiction, especially for Rue, is grief. Because remember y'all, Rue lost her father. And one thing grief does, it makes the world feel unsafe. Because the person who helped regulate your nervous system is gone. The person who helped you to feel protected is gone. And now your brain starts searching for something, anything that helps you to feel okay again. And for some people, that is substances. For some people, it's work. For some people, it's achievement. And for some people, it's relationships. The coping strategy changes over time, but one thing that I know for certain is that the wound underneath often stays the same. And here's the truth bomb. Sometimes What looks like addiction is actually an attempt to escape unbearable emotional pain. Now, I love Rue, but let's move on to somebody else. Because Rue teaches us what happens when we fear feelings, but Cassie teaches us what happens when we fear abandonment. Oof. Okay, now listen. If you've ever struggled with people pleasing, shape shifting, or feeling like your worth depends on being chosen, this next part might sting a little bit. Okay, so remember the scene when Cassie wakes up at 4 in the morning to get ready for Nate? And that wasn't because he asked her to, not because he demanded it, but because she became consumed with the ideal of being what he wanted, changing her appearance, changing her routine, changing herself completely. And the reason that scene is so powerful is because it isn't actually about Nate. It's about identity. It's about what happens when being chosen becomes more important than being yourself. People watching the show often say things like, dang, Cassie doing too much. And honestly, she is. But trauma often looks like doing too much. Because children who experience inconsistency frequently, they learn that if I become exactly what people want, maybe they won't leave. If I can be prettier, maybe they won't leave. If I can just be easier, maybe they won't leave. And ultimately, if I can be enough, then maybe they won't leave. And here's the heartbreaking part for Cassie. No amount of performing can heal abandonment wounds because the wound isn't really asking, will they choose me? The wound is really asking, am I lovable if nobody chooses me? And that is completely different. And while Cassie is terrified of abandonment, Nate is terrified of vulnerability. Now, before y'all throw y'all phone across the room, stay with me because understanding somebody is not the same thing as excusing them. So remember the scene where Nate sits in silence after another emotional interaction? His face barely changes, his emotions barely move, and everything stays locked down, like real tight. Everything stays controlled. And that's important because emotional suppression is often praised in our society, especially in men. People call it strength, people call it toughness, people call it leadership. But sometimes emotional suppression is simply fear wearing armor. Because when vulnerability feels dangerous, control starts to feel safer. And when shame feels overwhelming, control starts feeling safer. When emotions feel unsafe, control starts to feel safer. And then suddenly the person isn't connecting. They're managing, they're controlling, they're protecting. Because underneath the behavior is a person terrified of being exposed. And here's where I think Euphoria gets something right. Every single person in this show is looking for safety. They're just looking for it in different ways. Rue looks for safety through escape. Cassie looks for safety through approval. And Nate looks for safety through control. Different behaviors, same needs. And speaking of safety, we have to talk about Maddy. Because if Cassie represents fear of abandonment, Maddy represents what happens when intensity gets confused with love. Because y'all remember that scene after one of the many, when I say many, I mean many explosive fights between Maddy and Nate? The yelling, the tears, the breakups, the makeups, the emotional roller coaster. And then somehow they're pulled right back to each other. And if you have never experienced relational trauma, you may have watched this and said, why doesn't she just leave? But people who experience inconsistency in relationships understand something most people don't. And that is, your nervous system can become attached to activation, meaning your body starts confusing emotional intensity with emotional connection. The relationship feels alive, it feels passionate, it feels magnetic. But what it often lacks is always safety. And that's what trauma bonds do. Trauma bonds are not built on healthy attachment. They're built on cycles: pain, relief, pain, relief, pain, relief. And eventually, the nervous system starts chasing the relief, not the person. Pause, because y'all got to hear that again. Eventually, the nervous system starts chasing the relief, not the person. And sometimes people are not attached to the person, they're attached to the emotional cycle, the reunion, the apology, the brief moment where everything feels okay again. And that's why leaving can feel so difficult, because you're not only grieving the relationship, you're grieving the hope that maybe this time something will be different. And if you've ever stayed too long, gone back too many times, or convinced yourself that chemistry was enough, I want you to hear me. You're not crazy. You're not dumb. You're not weak. It is simply that your nervous system may have learned to associate unpredictability with love. And healing means teaching your body something different. Now, here's the part of the episode where some people get uncomfortable, because it's easy to watch Euphoria and point fingers. It's easy to say, Rue should have done this, Cassie should have done that. Heck, Nate needs therapy, Maddy needs therapy, everybody needs therapy. And honestly, you ain't wrong. You're not wrong. But here's the deeper question: how many of us are doing the exact same things, but maybe in a more socially acceptable way? Hear me out. Maybe you're not using drugs, but you are using work. Maybe you're not obsessing over a boyfriend, but you are obsessing over achievements. Maybe you're not controlling people, but you are controlling every outcome because uncertainty makes you feel anxious. And maybe you're not staying in a toxic relationship, but you are emotionally unavailable so nobody can hurt you. See, trauma grows up. It changes clothing, it gets a career, it gets married, it starts a business, it gets a degree, it becomes highly functional. And that's why so many successful people are still struggling relationally, because healing isn't about looking successful. Healing is about feeling safe. And that's a completely different thing. And I want to point this out because one of the saddest realities of relational trauma is that many people spend years trying to solve emotional wounds with behavior solutions. Work harder, achieve more, be prettier, be more successful, be more helpful, be more independent. And none of those things actually answer the question underneath. The question underneath is, am I worthy if I stop performing? Am I lovable if I stop proving? Am I safe if I stop controlling? Am I enough if I stop earning? And that's the work. That's the healing. Because every attachment wound eventually brings us back to the same place. And learning that our worth was never supposed to be contingent upon performance. Now, before we end today, I want you to think about something. What character did you judge the most? Seriously, who irritated you? Who frustrated you? Who made you yell at the television? Because sometimes the people who trigger us the most are showing us something we haven't fully healed ourselves. Ooh. And it's maybe because you saw your abandonment wounds in Cassie. Maybe you saw your grief in Rue. Maybe you saw your emotional armor in Nate. And maybe you saw your trauma bond in Maddy. Or maybe you saw pieces of yourself in all of them. Because the truth is, most of us are not one character. We're a collection of coping strategies, a collection of adaptations, a collection of wounds trying their best to become wisdom. And that's why I think Euphoria resonates with so many people, not because it's entertaining, not because it's dramatic, but because underneath all of the chaos is something deeply human. It's a group of people desperately trying to feel safe. And that's just like the rest of us. So here's another truth bomb before we go. What if the behavior you're judging in yourself today started as a protection before it became a problem? And I want you to really sit with that, because healing doesn't begin with shame. Healing begins with understanding. Compassion creates curiosity. Curiosity creates awareness. And awareness creates change. And of course, if we are able to implement change, that creates freedom. And I want to thank y'all for hanging out with me today. And if this episode resonated with you, send it to someone who loves Euphoria or someone who's doing the hard work of healing their attachment wounds. And let me know what movie or TV show we should analyze next through a relational attachment lens. Because, baby, the therapists are outside now, and we are unpacking everybody. So until next time, take care of yourself. And remember, you can honor the coping strategies that protected you while still choosing a healthier way forward. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Rewired for Love. If today's conversation resonated with you, share with someone you care about, or take a moment to leave a review. Your feedback helps this community to grow and keeps these healing conversations flowing. You can also follow me and come hang out with me on all socials, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, all of them at Rewired for Love Podcast. Go there to get your daily doses of healing, honesty, and a whole lot of love. Until next time, keep listening to your body, lead with compassion, and remember, you are safe enough to love and be loved.